Good morning. This is Ron with Team 3 Canada and representing Evie, Abby, and Jordan as well. And today we're going to go over the cybersecurity risk assessment that we developed for our project, Project 2. And the agenda is we're going to discuss the FVEY and Canadian aspects. In particular, we're going to talk about the people, process, and technology that is involved in cybersecurity. We're going to discuss a bit of an overview and its application, people, process, and technology to the Canadian area. Essentially, cybersecurity aspects that are applied to the Canadian systems. We're going to look at the vulnerability matrix in terms of what we discovered and how those items can be addressed for Canada. And we have several recommendations for the Canadian cybersecurity risk mitigation as well as the FVEY nations, as we do recommend communication to FVEY as part of an overall and comprehensive cybersecurity mitigation, again, for the people, the processes, and the technology involved, not only with Canada, but with the FVEY nations. The background is the FVEY Global Economic Summit held in the United Kingdom is involving Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. FVEY originated from sharing of the Soviet Union era, and FVEY shares global intelligence concerning global threats, including cybersecurity, defense, geospatial, and signal intelligence. And thereby, one of the recommendations, just jumping ahead, is the sharing of information for an attempted hack that we discovered on our system. The overarching goal necessary for FVEY and the summit is, while each country supports, maintains, and is responsible for their own network, coordination is necessary to support robust cybersecurity efforts. Again, people, process, and technology. Let's cover that briefly. People, our employees, can create some of the greatest risks to cybersecurity. And in our research, we discovered that well over 80% of the exfiltration of data initially started with some sort of social engineering attack, if you will, involving people. And for Canada, excuse me while I adjust my glasses, for Canada, there's cybersecurity awareness and training, and other training education programs are necessary. So that's sort of the mitigation, but we'll get a little deeper into the weeds. On the process ensures that IT teams have strategies in place to proactively prevent and respond quickly and effectively in the event of a cybersecurity incident. So essentially for Canada, it's a combination of policies and procedures that tighten up the cybersecurity, as well as incident reporting procedures and an incident response plan. We'll discuss what the distinction is between those two. Data and digital forensics as well, that in the event of a hack, as we did have, and we'll go over some of those items as well. Some of the essential items we've started listing, and we'll look at a vulnerability matrix, but some of the essential items for Canada is authentication. And authentication, just a quick definition, is the process that ensures and confirms a user's identity. As it applies to Canada, we would implement a system like Windows Server 2016 that supports Active Directory and authentication. In terms of multifactor is the use of technology that provides multiple ways of entering into a system. Oftentimes it's two-factor authentication that's used. And those items include something you know, knowledge, something you have, the possession, and inheritance, something you are. So for example, something you know, perhaps a PIN number, something you have, a card of some sort, and something you are, perhaps an iris scan or palm print scan. And we would implement, in terms of the Canadian system, A product like Duo, which supports MFA, and it uses actually cell phones as part of the multi-factor authentication aspect. Also essential to Canada is the authorization. And the authorization is the allowance of an individual to particular data resources. And we also teased out the distinction between authentication and authorization. Generally, authentication is allowing someone into the system, and authorization is allowing that person, once they're past the authentication area, is to allow them access to different data resources. So as it's applied to Canada, again, a system like Windows Server 2016, we'd use Active Directory to support authorization through the use of group policy and group policy objects. Access control is the selective restriction of access to a resource, basically the what versus the access management. And again, with applied to Canada, we would be creating ACLs through the use of Active Directory. ACLs are generated through group policy objects in Active Directory. Again, you can use other systems like the Linux system, but we're leaning towards Windows Active Directory in terms of support and the ability to do the effective management rather than getting into the higher level details that might be needed with, let's say, various Linux versions. Also essential to Canada is access control types. We've listed several access control types. Really, there's discretionary access control, where the resource owner designates who has access. Mandatory access control, we also relate that to like a military type of approach, where you have confidential, secret, or top secret labels for users that are then tagged with that data resource, that matching. The role-based and the rule-based access control, but we're going to lean on the role-based access control, which provides access based on the job title and role. And also, as it applies to Canada, we're going to use RBAC and lean on Active Directory group policies as well, because that's group policies. You can go with any of these DAC, MAC, RBAC, or RAC rule-based with Active Directory, but RBAC seems to be the preferred method, if you will. As far as essential to Canada, a threat is an adversarial force, whereas a threat agent is an element that provides the delivery. And we wanted to make that distinction because as we look at the vulnerability matrix in just a second, things that we discovered, we want to make sure as it applies to Canada, there's going to be some sort of periodic review to identify threats and threat agents. We would lean on either the 800-171 or the ISO 27001, which is more likely. Canada does use, as we noted in a lot of our reporting, they do adhere to some of the 800-171, mostly because Canada has a whole lot of manufacturers that supply parts and pieces to the U.S. Department of Defense. So the 800-171 is one of the methods. And there is a substantial overlap with the ISO 27001 and the 800-171. And as of late, the CMMC capability maturity model was actually released by DoD on Friday. And it kind of blends a little bit of the 27001 into, just a little bit, into the 800-171 in a stepwise 5-tier model. But that being said, that's how we would approach that. Again, with threat actors, we looked at NIST in terms of a whole list of what a threat actor is. And these are small sampling of what NIST provides. A cyber terrorist, for example, the likelihood of occurrence over to the right-hand side is high. Of course, the threat category is human. If we look down, the opportunistic insider with restricted rights, It's kind of unlikely the way that NIST was looking at it. So in terms of 27001 and NIST, kind of a combination approach, we would look at threat actors as one of our cyclical reviews of our information systems and network. Essential to Canada is a distinction between vulnerability and inherent weakness or vulnerability as a design flaw. But within Canada, we're going to look at some vulnerabilities on our vulnerability matrix coming up. Anyway, we also recommend, as it applies to Canada and vulnerability, is a use of a scanning tool like Nessus. And there's other tools like Tripwire to discover configuration flaws, the Burp Suite, which is for software, if you will, and Open Application Security Project, OWASP, which is a standard set of vulnerability mitigations that we could also apply in terms of the Canadian systems. And that covers not only application systems and the networks, but also databases and the website. One of the things that we'll see in the upcoming vulnerability is that we were hacked through Mozilla Firefox, and we'll look at that particular item. So that's how that applies. Attack vectors, in terms of an attack vector, by definition, an attack vector is a technique used by means which unauthorized access is gained to the information system. And attack vectors, as we'll see on our vulnerability matrix, included a couple of things like the website and social engineering as well. But it can include hardware, operating system, application systems, the network, physical access, as well as human factors and training or the lack of training. As it applies again to Canada, we'd have a heavy emphasis on training, including scanning tools as well. So we approach it both in terms of training and operational scanning, if you will. Here's some threat examples. Audit compromise. We experienced cyber brute force with our attack. That would be one of the compromises. And that over to the right-hand side is a list of the impact on the CIA triad. With cyber brute force, disclosure of information, because we also had an SQL attack, well, that would be part and parcel of the brute force as well as the SQL injection attack. That could also result in modification or destruction of the data, and with brute force in particular, denial of service. We were seeing a denial of service, so that's how that applies. And getting back to the Canadian vulnerability matrix, and I know the printing is a little bit small on this, but let's kind of zero in on a couple of things. One of the things that we found is the SQL injection attack. It was a server-side injection attack, and the impact was certainly high. And some of the mitigations are listed here: the creation and use of whitelisting, but blacklisting, that would be one of the items. And number two, use of some sort of structured mechanism within the SQL program to inspect the data coming into the system, and so that odd strings don't get to the database and exfiltrate data. Another item down, second tier down, is a telecommunications and networking item. And that was the execution of unauthorized code, which resulted in a denial of service for our network. Some of the mitigations implement the use of languages such as Java and Perl. Those are really not fully secure, but they tighten up the realm, if you will. But also, in addition to using like Java and that sort of thing, there should be some structured and standard methods used with the development of software that we'll go into with Project 3 upcoming. But those kind of secured software development techniques also need to be employed. Hardening of systems, we'll talk about some of that in our recommendations that are coming up. So that would be the second item. Regarding the third item, cryptanalysis attack, we also noticed that some of the wireless networking was susceptible the way it was configured. So part of the mitigation with wireless, you want to isolate, if you will, the open network that you provide to guests from the organization network. So we recommend a defense-in-depth strategy where we not only segment the networks, but we also develop layers of trust within the network, and that's coming up within our recommendations as well. We'll discuss that. Fourth item on our vulnerabilities is phishing, malware, potentially unwanted programs, and HTTP delete method abuse. That's the fourth item here. Basically, that's a server-side attack that we noticed, and that's also a high vulnerability. That's also filtering out items on a firewall, if you will, or IDS or IPS. Again, the distinction between an IDS and IPS, IDS will detect and will let traffic through, whereas IPS will perhaps slow down traffic because it could be set to not only trigger, but it could be set to shunt any particular traffic. So we would set some triggering mechanisms up to alert for these CVE scores based on the CVSS database. A fifth one is the DOS and SQL injections as well. Denial of service when Microsoft Hyper-V network switch on host server fails. We looked at that because we also were suspicious of the way the setup was for our Hyper-V environment. Again, we're leaning on the Windows environment, server environment, and we would use Hyper-V, but we'd also need to isolate some of the networks in a trusted zone model. Some of the emerging risk, again, denial of service, malware. And we saw the execution of unauthorized code. And again, the key point with number one, way at the bottom, is the segregation of networks. So not only would we propose to segregate the guest wireless from the organizational wireless, but we'd also create layers of trust within beyond several firewalls. We'd have an initial DMZ, and we'd prevent any kind of entry into, let's say, the database by creating a unique network for a trust layer. Finally, we also looked at brute force attacks, and again, that was recognized as high. Again, things like strong password would be one way of doing that. There's several mechanisms that we'd only limit password attempts to 5. I know some more restrictive environments say 3. But presently, we had it at pretty much open. We'd also have a setup where we would use uppercase, lowercase, and have as well as special characters for the password, as well as have at least 12 generations of passwords. So we would use that, and we'd also test the system out using things like OPH crack and Cain-enable to do some testing on our network. So that's kind of our vulnerability matrix for what we discovered. And one final item is the cross-site scripting that we noted, because we do have a vulnerability within our website. So we noted this as well. And that was kind of a medium level. Again, that would require us to isolate network traffic and filter traffic as we isolate those segments within the network. So moving on with the vulnerability analysis, we looked at the CVE scores of several different items. And again, our firewalls and IDS, IPS would be set up in such a way that they would pull the most current vulnerabilities. And by the way, the scanning tools Nessus will be bounced off of these as well, because we recommend a weekly scan at least for vulnerabilities, as well as active scanning. Again, with vulnerabilities as it pertains to Canada, if you look down the list, right about 2/3 of the way down, Microsoft is listed as some of the top 50 vulnerabilities on the database presently as of January 2020, a week ago. It's now February 1st. Microsoft had 751 noted vulnerabilities. A bulk of those were in the red category, which means it's in a critical area, with primarily the balance more so in the orange category, which means that you could tend to not only look at those, but maybe patch those up within, I think it's up to a 3-week period. Anyway, we would get on those pretty immediately, because each one of these vulnerabilities scores that, let's say, Nessus or even some of the IPS, IDS firewalls, they do give you the CVE score in terms of almost a stoplight model, but also give you mitigation control information as well that can be passed on to the network administrator or the database administrator or even the programming compliance area. Essential to risk acceptance for Canada. Now, again, we propose a cyclical review of all of the networks and all of the systems at least once a year. Now, NIST standards require once a year for the NIST 800-171. We feel that that is not very restrictive. We probably would implement this once every 6 months. But part of it is to look at the risk acceptance of different data stores and databases, as well as coding, and even some of the hardware, and to key them up against some of these risk acceptance categories. So for Canada, we do a periodic risk assessment and analysis and determine whether we will avoid a particular risk, accept a risk. For example, if it's a small database that has no particularly interesting information, we might accept the risk because to protect that database, it may cost more than the value of the information. Risk reduction is knowing the scope and cost of the risk, doing business with a government that contains CUI, confidential information. We may do reduction by doing a defense-in-depth strategy on certain data stores or databases. Risk transference, oftentimes that's related to insurance. We would insure some items to kind of eliminate the blunt or reduce the blunt of any kind of data exfiltration, but that would be taken in a careful measure. A risk sharing, where we would spread out the wealth, if you will, share the costs and responsibilities of that risk. So again, these 5 aspects are part and parcel of a risk analysis that we do recommend, if you will. Attribution analysis. One of the things, we did a forensic investigation of the hack, and we recommend as part of attribution analysis in the data forensics is that we dig down a little bit deeper and determine the source of the data and data corruption, if you will, the analysis of tools, the examination of tactics that were used, and trying to understand the business drivers and why the attack occurred a little more so than that it did occur, and what kind of tools. We want to get at the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the attack and determine why the attack occurred, not just only how it occurred. In a way, with digital forensics and how we approached it, we used this 10-step method, and I know there's more restrictive combined methods, if you will, that have 6 phases for digital forensics. But we looked at this one in particular because there was a lot of pre-incident preparation. There's pre-incident preparation, incident detection, and an initial response. Those three items are already pre-planned, so when a response does happen, you have canned forms and procedures and policies that you can follow. And then the duplication, we took a forensic copy and did the investigation on it. And we also recommended network monitoring. We had some recovery steps that we also recommend as well. And the initial, once all of the digital forensics is done, we also recommend a follow-up to not only, it's almost like a project plan where we look at the end of the project, we look at some of the best practices and see how we can refine our entire data forensics role that we executed on the hack that we had. Anyway, moving on to the next one. In terms of risk assessment methodologies that we recommend using something like the NIST model, and this is a copy and paste straight from the NIST 800-171, and the 853 also has the same model where you look at the threat source, and this is why we noted this as a definition, the threat event, and determine the vulnerability of that. And this spans people, process, and technology. We'd look at the people as a threat source, different aspects of internal and external. The process, in a way, some of our processes need to be tightened up. Our incident response planning, as well as our incident reporting procedure, needs to be tightened up. So that would be a process, if you will. And the technologies, again, the people, process, and technologies, we'd look at the firewalls, the network segmentation, the creation of VLANs as well. And this would be a cyclical process, again, measured against the threat sources and the threat events that are present in today's environments. Again, we specifically looked at the FVEY vulnerabilities and the Canadian vulnerabilities, because part and parcel of what we're doing, not only for Canada, is to share out this information. Some of the vulnerabilities, we did a deeper dive than probably was necessary, but we're OCD a little bit. So some of the physical facilities, we looked at disaster recovery, some backup, some redundant site, again, cloud-based services, the disaster recovery program, not only for Canada, but as a suggestion for FVEY. And by the way, if we're going out for cloud-based services, we'd want to make sure they're at least meet some sort of metal in terms of the stringent requirements. We looked at the NIST standards for FedRAMP cloud-based services. So we probably lean against that sort of a restriction if we're going out for cloud-based services. Physical items, power failure, we look at redundancy in terms of power, but also that would be part and parcel of our disaster recovery plan. Authentication, again, and the physical cutoff of fiber optic lines and trees falling, those type of things. So we took a very broad approach to the people, process, and technology when we looked at the vulnerabilities. Cyber brute force, that's one thing that we did have in place. So we would implement network monitoring, have periodic forensic scans, if you will, and approach of defense-in-depth strategy using IDS, IPS, or combined IDPS. Look at our ACLs that are generated from group policies. Look at the firewalls, whitelist and blacklist. So we have a whole gamut of things that we would need to do. And by the way, we also recommend the use of a POAM, a plan of action and milestones, that is pretty common in the cybersecurity area. Data disclosure attack was one of the attacks that we also ran up against. Again, that's part of that is the configuration management. So we'd look at the delta of what was changed. We'd have a baseline. We'd also again use a Defenseindepth. Denial of service attack. Again, a lot of those can be mitigated by using cloud-based services that do automatic load balancing. We would look into that and would recommend that in terms of FVEY mitigation. In terms of people, process, and technology, we continue with some other recommendations that we'll make down here right now. So we have a handful of recommendations. We would recommend security control testing, and that involves boundary defense, as well as malware defense, application security, account management and monitoring, a whole gamut. And we'd also recommend penetration testing, again, looking at the incident response capabilities. That would be part of the process. A lot of this would be the technology aspect. And we'd also look at things like access control. Access control is the people part in parts as well as the technology. Access control, the logical access, who has access to the system resources, and when those access is expired, if you will, when a person leaves or switches roles, we look at that in terms of the processes, in terms of people and their roles, and the technology that support that. We again use Active Directory. Another one is configuration management. We'd set a baseline. That way, if any other changes do occur, we would know almost immediately, because we can do an IDPS and other network monitoring that would alert on a change, if you will. So that would involve technology and processes as well. Another recommendation, incident response. Again, there's a distinction between the incident reporting plan and an incident response plan. The incident response plan, again, on the people side, designate roles of who does what during an incident. Again, an incident response should involve somebody from technology, should involve somebody from the VP level or higher, and should involve perhaps somebody from even marketing and communications to get the word out and assuage any kind of fear and consternation that may occur during a hack. So that would be one part in terms of incident response plan. Incident reporting is another people aspect. Is if ransomware occurs, which does happen in Project 3, but if ransomware or even a denial of service attack, as in Project 2, that we somebody recognizes that, they would. What we've done is created a form based on some of the NIST and ISO 27001 standards, and they would fill that out and alert IT services immediately with that form, and that way that launches the incident response team to take a look and see how deep and broad the incident is, so we could apply some mitigations to that. So that's a large part of the people aspect of the involvement. Another one is system and communication protections. As I mentioned before, one of the things is confidentiality of information at rest and in transit. So we would emphasize a high use of encryption, including BitLocker for data at rest on our systems and on the servers. It creates a little more expense for server drives to be encrypted, not so much on the hardware that we presently have, because we have Windows 10 Enterprise, so we just turn on BitLocker. And we would filter out these recommendations for encryption, both at rest and encryption for data in transit to the rest of the FVEY nations. So that would be a technology aspect. Again, Defenseindepth, we would layer our network design. We could do that with not only one firewall, but we also would have multiple firewalls and create layers of trust. We'd put our databases a little more securely behind the innermost ring of the network, and that would be isolated with firewalls and its own unique set of firewall rules as well. And we would use not only the layer 3 isolation for the as well as the layer 2, the VLAN layers for the Defenseindepth. Multifactor, as I mentioned before, this requires not only a technical aspect, but the people aspect. A multifactor, we would use a product like Duo, which would send a secondary key to a person's cell phone. Those registered cell phones would have to be managed by IT services. And so the user would have to, when they're doing certain aspects in, let's say, database work, or if they're a network administrator, they would use the multi-factor in order to gain access to information systems. So it wouldn't be a wide open network. That would add in another layer of technical and people defense. Again, recommendation is planning and reporting. Of course, with any kind of security, cybersecurity is we would have copious amounts of reporting to the CISO, as well as develop a plan of action and milestone for any mitigations that we would cyclically surface or that we would recognize during an attack. And in fact, the poem that we created for our immediate project 2 hacking includes the inclusion of whitelist, blacklist on firewalls, and some training for users not to click links, if you will. We would use something like KnowBe4 as a service provider that would help with our training aspect for users. And we'd also apply encryption and beef up our incident reporting procedure too. So those are some of the mitigations that we discussed and implemented for the Project 2. There's a bit of an overlap for Project 3 that we started digging into, and we'll get to some of those additional items later. But this covers probably 8 or 10 recommendations that the Team Canada has for cybersecurity for not only the Canadian systems, but also we will report these out to the FVE-wide nations as well. So there you have it, and we have a list of specific recommendation references right here. We did the digital investigation process from Carrier and Spatford, which is the 10-step model. It's a little more delineated than some other models. And we looked at the principles of cybersecurity, in particular from Conklin, a little more recent view, as well as the NIST 800-171 in particular for some of the DFAR cybersecurity requirements. And of course, DFAR's 800-171 teases off of 853A. So there you have it. And you have a good day. Hope you enjoyed that. Feel free to give us some questions, and we look forward to our next presentation with you. So thank you very much. Bye now.